Hello, happy Monday. Well, happy Monday for some, grumpy Monday for others, I expect. Mondays, I don't usually like Mondays very much, although I like my job, so that does make Mondays a lot easier. And of course, we're coming up for half term, so my children don't have an entire week of school, so it's easier to get them out of bed and out of the house. And also, in other news, I have finished my new book, the first draft of it. Here it is. It's a bit massive. It's actually over twice the book, twice the length of this book. So I think it might have to shrink a bit. And as you might have seen on the page, if you've been looking, the end went completely wrong. I had a plan, and as I wrote it, I could tell that the end was wrong. And I do trust my instincts. If my instinct says this is good, then I've got a reasonable, evidence has shown that it's okay. If my instinct says it's bad, it has to be sorted out. So that's going to have to be sorted out. It's a bit annoying because it's about, the manuscript's just short of 110,000 words, and I reckon the first 100,000 words are good, and the last 10,000 are, the timing's all wrong. Timing's all wrong. But never mind, I'll sort that out when I edit it, and I'll try and cut it down because I think it's a little too long. I think that's what an agent will say about it. Oh, can you cut it? So I'll have a go. We are here for chapter 14, and shortly after this video I will do chapter 15. We've got double bills today and tomorrow to get this book finished before half-term holidays. The last chapter, chapter 13, was quite dramatic. There was quite a lot in there, wasn't there? Joe went out for a walk with Lucy, and they returned to find Jackson and Metcalf, the footman, beating up Amos, really savagely beating him up, just sort of outside the servant quarters of the house. And Amos retaliated, was sort of spurred on by Joe and Lucy's presence to retaliate, and he punched Jackson, and then he regretted it. And then William has called the whole household together, all the servants, and said that anybody who has a problem living with these people, he's told them what he's learnt about how slaves are treated, what the journey's like to get to the West Indies from Africa, and how slaves are treated once they get there. And he says that he has every intention of making this a safe place for the few that he was able to bring home with him. And if anybody doesn't like it, they can leave. And a number of staff do leave. Both the footmen leave because they're very indignant indignant doesn't really cut it, actually outraged that William didn't take their side against Amos after he punched them. Never mind the fact that they provoked him terribly, and they gave him far worse than what he gave back. They still think they were in the right. So they've left, and one of the housemaids has left, and now in the evening, Sarah, the nursemaid who looks after Lucy's brother Tommy, has been called into the withdrawing room and asked if she could possibly become housemaid because they've lost a housemaid. And she says, well, what about Florence? Why should Florence not be the housemaid? And they say, well, Billy and Rose have had a lot of upheaval, so it's better for them if Rose stays with them, if Florence stays with them. And she's absolutely furious. And she basically reveals what she heard Joe say in the nursery a couple of days ago about not being who they want him to be and not wanting to pretend anymore. And so we finished the chapter. Finally, William spoke. What do you have to say to this, Josiah? And if you're not Josiah, whoever are you? Chapter 14. Joe and Lucy both answered at the same time. It's true, Joe said. She's lying, Lucy declared. They exchanged looks. Joe held up his bandaged hand. No, Lucy, he said. His heart was pounding. This has gone on long enough. It's true, he repeated, looking William in the eye. I'm not Josiah. But you look so like him. How is this possible? Ellen scrutinised Joe. Though now I think of it, she went on, you do lack certain mannerisms. In fact, your demeanour is quite different." She said something in French. Joe gazed at her blankly. She shook her head. "You really didn't understand what I just said, did you? I asked about your hand." "Oh, I see. We did it deliberately," Joe said. "It was supposed to be me, but I couldn't do it, and then Lucy did it because we realised I couldn't go to school with Peter." He knew he was babbling. He dreaded this moment, but now it was here, it was a relief to get it all out. "I wouldn't have been able to do any of the work, you see. Where I come from, we learn different things." He trailed off, watching Lucy's mother. She seemed intrigued rather than angry. Perhaps it would all be okay. Maybe they would let him stay. Then William spoke, his voice hard. "So your grand confession," he said, "this revelation that you should be more honest with us, it was a lie?" Joe hung his head. "And the business of the French accent?" "I'm not French," Joe said miserably. "I see. And you're not my nephew either. Which begs the question, who are you?" Joe looked imploringly at Lucy. She was staring down at her lap, her face taut. He floundered. He wanted to be truthful, but Lucy had been confident that none of them would believe him. The seconds stretched out. "My name is Joe," he said at last, "short for Joseph, actually. When I first arrived in Bristol and Hannah saw me, I didn't realise she'd mistaken me for Josiah. I went along with it because I had nowhere else to go." "So it was you who arrived that morning in February," Ellen said. "And then the real Josiah appeared. When? Later that day. That explains a lot." She added to herself, "And where did you go when he arrived?" Joe swallowed. "I disappeared." He strained his ears, hoping against hope to hear the telltale hissing. Everything would be so much easier if he vanished back into his own world right now. If Lucy's parents saw it, they would understand in a way he could never explain. But there was no hiss. He remained solidly in the withdrawing room. "You disappeared," William repeated coldly. "You turned up, a perfect stranger. You took advantage of our hospitality. You pretended to be someone you weren't. And when the real boy appeared, you just went." He spat out the last two words. "How convenient for you that Josiah decided to leave us last week. All that nonsense about the ship going aground, it was one lie after another." Joe looked at the floor. "Leave now," commanded William. "But father," Lucy cried out, "he couldn't help it, and he's kinder and more decent than Josiah ever was." "That is neither here nor there," her father snapped. "I cannot have someone in the house who has duped us all. How could we trust him now?" "Please," Lucy begged. "I know him. I trust him." Joe stood with his head bowed, awaiting sentence. "I have problems enough without this, Lucy." William stood up. "Joe, Joseph, whoever you are, wherever you come from, go now." Joe raised his head. "I'm sorry," he said to Ellen. Then he turned to William. "I didn't mean any harm." He glanced at his friend. Her eyes were bright with tears. He couldn't say goodbye to her here, not in front of the others. Avoiding Sarah's gaze, he left the room. In the hall, Morley had his hat and coat ready. Joe took them meekly. He looked around for some way to delay, but he had nothing to pack, and he was wearing the clothes he'd arrived in. There was nothing to stop him leaving right now. Still he wavered. He didn't want to go without saying goodbye to Lucy. But she didn't come out. He waited another minute, conscious of Morley standing expectantly by the front door. Joe imagined himself still here when William emerged. He gulped. Better to go now. Perhaps he might see Lucy later somehow, or tomorrow. The front door closed instantly behind him. Standing on the doorstep, Joe looked up and down the street. Where could he go? It was a big lorry, wasn't it? Where could he go? The evening was cool. He put on his coat and hat. If the temperature dropped overnight, he shivered. Was he really going to sleep in a doorway or under a hedge? Perhaps he should try one of the half-built houses. At least he might find shelter there. He trotted down the steps and set off up the road. On the corner of the street that led to Brandon Hill, he paused. No noise was coming from the building site. He walked up the track towards it. The workmen seemed to have left for the day. Joe tried to take heart from this. They might easily have still been there, since it wasn't yet dusk. He approached the two unfinished buildings at the end of the track. They stood, silent and unlit. There was glass in the windows of the first, but when Joe tried the door, it seemed to be barred. He stepped back. The rooms behind the glass were empty, so there was nothing to steal. But perhaps other people might have had the same idea as him. A house like this could be taken over by whole families at night if it wasn't shut up. He turned to the other unfinished building. The windows of this one were empty, like eye sockets in a skull. He moved closer and listened. No sound came from within. All he could hear were the distant cries of the seagulls from the quay, and the occasional shout over the rumbling of wheels. Quietly, he walked round to the back of the house until he found a window he could reach. He listened again. Nothing. He climbed awkwardly onto the sill, careful not to rip his breeches or snag his coat or stockings. Not that it mattered, he thought. After all, there was nobody but him to care. A wave of loneliness swept over him. He swung his legs over the sill and dropped down onto the floor. Inside the walls, the sounds of the city were even fainter. He wandered through the rooms until he found a dry corner that wasn't too draughty. With no idea of what else to do, he huddled down. In a few minutes, the chill had seeped right through him. The floor was wood, but the walls were stone. He turned up his collar and tried sitting forward. It was less cold, but just as uncomfortable. He wondered if he might be able to sleep. It would be better if he could. He would have to be gone at dawn before the workmen came back. But it was too early. Sleep didn't come. Instead, he sat wretchedly with his chin on his knees, wondering what on earth he was going to do. He must have dozed without realising, however, because he was startled into alertness by voices. He rubbed his eyes. It was dark now, except for the glow of a lamp beyond the doorway to the next room. Two men were talking quietly. They must have sought shelter here like him. He was so cold now. His muscles felt stiff. He breathed on his hands to warm them. Then he heard something that made his heart stop. "Joseph something or another," one of the voices said. "Not Josiah. So he said, anyway. In any case, my uncle sent him packing. I wish I'd been there." The other person mumbled agreement. Joe's heart started beating again, extra fast, as though it wanted to leap out of his chest. The first voice had to be Tobias. But who was he talking to? "You know, I was wondering what was the matter with him," Lucy's cousin went on. "He was different to before. He was supposed to be doing his bit, same as you and me, but I didn't see it once after he came back." The other voice spoke. "Can we make something of it, do you think?" Joe shut his eyes to listen. He knew this voice, but it didn't usually speak like this. This was a voice that whined or jeered. "Maybe," Tobias was thoughtful, "we could make it look like he lured them away as revenge on my uncle." "What would we do? I thought the plan was to get them to leave of their own accord." Tobias gave a short laugh. "I'd already given up on that. After all, you had a good go, and see where that got us. No, I've been thinking we can do better than that. If you're still willing to lend a hand, I reckon there's money to be made." "You think?" "Well, I'd not say no, though the nigger did me a favour, actually. Old Daniel's paying me more than I was earning before, and there's a chance of advancement. Even without that, it's good to be back in a house where we all think alike." Joe held his breath. This must be Jackson. "All right for some," Tobias grumbled, "but I haven't given up. I was asking around today. There's a man who collects runaway slaves. Someone said he sells them back to the plantations. He's bound to have contacts in the West Indies. If we can get our 4 on the Isabella when it sails, we should make a tidy sum." "But is the nigger fit enough?" Jackson asked. "I gave him a lot worse than he gave me." There was a note of pride in the footman's voice. "I don't care if he's fit or not." "I was only thinking of the price," wheedled Jackson. "We'll get more for him if he looks well." There was a pause. Then Tobias said, "We could take them tomorrow so that it looks like the boy's revenge, then keep them somewhere till the nigger's face is healed." He stopped, then went on, thinking aloud. "The Isabella might leave any time, mind you. Once it's gone, we could have a long wait for the next ship. Might be better to say there was a scuffle when we took him. The others will be in better shape if we hand them over straight away, too, and trying to hide them will be risky. My uncle will have search parties out the moment they're missed, and I'm not sure where we could keep them that they wouldn't be found." In the next room, Joe struggled to his feet, trying not to make a sound. Tobias and Jackson had relaxed enough to talk normally, but they would still notice any unexpected noise. He squinted around in the darkness. There was only one doorway, and they were on the other side of it, but there was a window. He could climb out of that. Then he could get back to Lucy's house and warn her and her father. He clambered onto the sill as quietly as he could and peered down outside. But the drop from this window was much further than he'd expected. 3 meters at least. This room must be above the servants' entrance. He swallowed and screwed up his eyes to try and see better. The ground below looked uneven and rocky. If he jumped, he might well break his ankle. Suddenly, lamplight swung across the room. Joe froze. Shadows sprang through the doorway and loomed on the walls. He crouched in the window, still as a stone, praying Tobias wouldn't notice him. It was a vain hope. "Well, well, look, Jackson, I did hear something. It's the impostor himself." The 2 young men advanced on Joe. He scanned the ground outside again, but there was nowhere he could safely land. As he swivelled round, Jackson flew at him. "You see this?" He jabbed at his broken nose. "This is your fault." "Mine?" Joe faltered. "But Amos—" Jackson didn't let him finish. He grabbed Joe by the shoulders and hauled him down from the sill. Tobias stood back, watching. "It was you the nigger was looking at before he punched me," Jackson screeched. "The thought hadn't crossed his mind until you came along with that snivelling little girl." Joe shook Jackson's hands off him, abruptly furious. "How dare you call Lucy snivelling when I think how you crawled to your master? Yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir," he mimicked. Tobias laughed. Jackson's face darkened. "You encouraged a black man to rise up against his betters," the footman roared. Joe knew he should be afraid. It was 2 against 1, and they were both a good deal bigger than him. But rage made him feel invincible. "What makes you better than Amos?" he yelled back. "I know what you were doing, even before you beat him up. I know what you did with the wax. And you," he rounded on Tobias, "I know what you did with the coffee. But Amos was man enough to take your bullying and say nothing. He's tougher than you, and he's braver too." The smirk was gone from Tobias's lips. Joe thundered on. "You think because you have white skin and his is black that you're better than him. Well, you're not. He's more of a man than both of you put together." He stopped to draw breath. He hadn't expected to get this far before one of them attacked him. His eyes flicked from Tobias to Jackson and then back to Tobias again. But it was Jackson who lunged. Joe darted sideways beneath his fist. The footman staggered, then straightened up, ready to swing again. This time Joe's way was blocked by Tobias. "A real nigger lover, aren't you?" Tobias sneered. "You're even worse than my uncle. Such a pity you won't be able to save them. I expect that's what you were thinking, you little rat. But we've got you now. We'll finish you." Joe saw the pleasure in Tobias's eyes. "And you know the best thing of all? Nobody will even miss you." Joe weighed his options swiftly. It sounded as though Tobias was prepared to kill him. Fear ran through Joe's blood. But Tobias wouldn't be able to do it, he reminded himself. He was almost sure to be pulled back into his own world. If that happened, though, he wouldn't have the chance to warn Lucy. Tobias and Jackson would kidnap Amos and the others and sell them back to the slave traders. For their sake, he had to try and escape. He ducked Jackson's second punch and flung himself towards the door. It was futile. He knew at once. Tobias whipped round and caught him with a massive blow to the stomach. Joe keeled over, unable to breathe. His attackers closed in, kicking and pounding him as he lay on the floor. Joe curled his arms around his head. His knees were up by his stomach. It didn't seem to help. The assault came from all sides, one crunching blow after another. On and on it went, or so it seemed. Was this how Amos had felt? Joe wondered. Waiting for the end? For Amos, of course, the only end might be death. Perhaps this was what death was like, the fading of pain into the distance. In fact, perhaps this was death, Joe thought. Perhaps he was dying. He could still sense Jackson and Tobias moving around him, but he couldn't feel their fists or feet, nor could he hear their voices over the hissing. The darkness brightened. Inside became outside. Night became day. The sun burst down on Joe. He was half kneeling on a pavement, panting. For a few seconds he couldn't think where he was. This was his own world, he knew, but what had he been doing before he slipped into Lucy's time? Cautiously, he raised his head. The dizziness wasn't as bad as usual. His heart was still hammering, but it was anger he felt rather than fear. Anger at what had been done to Amos by these men and others before them. Fury surged through him and lifted him to his feet. So he's safe, he's back in our world, back in our time. But is Amos safe? You know, Joe, that was Joe's chance, wasn't it? To try and rescue Amos and Florence before Jackson and Tobias try and kidnap them and sell them to the slave traders to send them back to the West Indies. And now that Joe's back at home, that is very likely to happen. I will do chapter 15 presently, read that presently. I'm half expecting the doorbell to go because somebody's coming to sort out my electricity meter. So I might postpone this until they've been the next chapter. You don't need to know that. I will see you sometime later or sometime again soon. I hope you're enjoying this, but we're really close to the end now. See you soon.